I refused my parents' demand to give my $600,000 home to my sister as a wedding gift. My father swung a heavy brass centerpiece at my head, knocking me unconscious in a pool of blood. But as I woke up, the real show began. Her new husband grabbed the microphone in front of 300 guests and exposed a financial secret that ruined my parents and my sister permanently. Before I continue this story, tell me where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to a toxic family. My name is Riley, 26 years old, and until my sister Madison wedding day, I thought I knew how low my family could stoop. I was wrong. The air inside the opulent bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel smelled overwhelmingly of expensive hairspray and wilting white roses. Outside those heavy mahogany doors, a live jazz band entertained hundreds of affluent guests, completely unaware of the hostility brewing just 30 minutes before the cake-cutting ceremony. I stood near the vanity, adjusting the strap of my silk dress, eager to just survive the rest of the evening. That was when the heavy glass door clicked shut and the lock engaged. My father Richard marched across the room and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the glass coffee table right in front of me. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet suite, making me flinch. The heavy paper stock slid across the polished surface and stopped at my feet. "Sign it right now." Riley, my father ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. His face was flushed red, and the scent of expensive bourbon accompanied his words. I glanced down at the bold print on the top page. It was a quitclaim deed. The property address listed was my house in Silicon Valley. I looked up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I kept my face perfectly still. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked, pushing the papers back across the glass. "I am not giving Madison my house." My father slammed his fist onto the table, making the champagne flutes rattle. "You will do exactly as I say. Dion family just gifted them a luxury yacht for their wedding present. Do you have any idea how that makes us look? Madison cannot walk into that family with nothing. She needs an asset that matches their status, and your house is the only thing we have that fits the bill." The sheer entitlement in his voice was not new, but the magnitude of his demand was staggering. He was actually demanding the home I had bled to build. "You mean the home I bought with my own money?" I corrected him, stepping away from the table. "The home you explicitly told me I would never be able to afford when you kicked me out 6 years ago. Madison gets a yacht, so I go homeless to balance the scales." "Do not twist my words into a sob story." My father sneered, adjusting his tie as if my resistance was merely a minor inconvenience. "You do not even need a house that big. You are single, you work from home, and you have no social standing to maintain. Madison is stepping into high society. The Washingtons expect certain wealth from their new family. If they find out Madison has no real estate portfolio, they will look down on her. They will look down on us. So let them." I shot back, crossing my arms. "Madison lies to her future husband are not my emergency. If she wanted a real estate portfolio, she should have worked for it instead of relying on you to steal mine." My father stepped closer, using his imposing height to try and intimidate me, a tactic he had perfected during my childhood. "You owe this family, Riley. We fed you, we clothed you, and you embarrassed us by running off to do that fake tech design garbage instead of supporting your sister career." I let out a dry laugh. "Supporting my sister career? You mean working double shifts at the diner so I could pay off the credit cards Madison maxed out on designer bags? Or when you took my entire college fund to pay for her luxury car? I paid my dues. Dad, I do not owe this family a dime, let alone my entire net worth." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "You are part of this family, which means your assets are our assets. Madison is the one marrying into the Washington family. She is the one securing our social standing in this city. You are just a selfish, ungrateful brat who got lucky with some computer app. You are going to sign this deed and transfer the property to her name today, or so help me God." I yanked my arm out of his grasp, my heels scraping sharply against the marble floor as I stepped back toward the vanity. Let me be perfectly clear, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. That house is mine. I earned every single brick of it, while you and Mom were busy treating me like a bank account to fund Madison luxury lifestyle. I am not signing anything, and you cannot force me. My father's eyes darkened, a terrifying shadow crossing his face that I had not seen since I was a teenager. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen, and tossed it onto the quitclaim deed. It rolled across the paper, stopping right at the signature line. He moved to stand directly in front of the locked mahogany door, crossing his arms over his chest. "You are not listening to me, Riley," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are not walking out of this room until your signature is on that paper." Before I could even process the physical threat of my father blocking the only exit, the sharp clack of designer heels striking the marble floor diverted my attention. My mother, Patricia, stepped out from the shadows near the velvet chaise lounge. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The suffocating scent of her expensive perfume rolled over me instantly, bringing back a wave of childhood anxiety. She positioned herself right next to my father, forming a literal wall between me and the door. "You are making a scene over nothing, Riley," my mother said, her voice dripping with that familiar condescending sweetness she always used right before twisting the knife. "You have always been such a selfish brat. Your father is simply asking you to do the right thing for your sister for once in your life." I stared at her, the silver fountain pen feeling cold and heavy in my hand. "The right thing?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think extorting me for a $600,000 property 30 minutes before Madison walks down the aisle is just a casual family favor?" My mother took a slow sip of her champagne and rolled her eyes. "Do not use that tone with me. We all know you do not actually deserve that house. You only got it by abandoning this family when we needed you most. Have you forgotten how you treated us? Have you forgotten what you did when you turned 18? The sheer audacity of her revisionist history made my blood run cold. "Abandoned you," I repeated, gripping the edge of the glass vanity to keep my hands from shaking. "You told me I had to drop out of community college and work double shifts at the diner to pay off the $30,000 Madison racked up on your credit cards. You wanted me to bankrupt my own future to fund her spring break trips to Cabo and her designer shoe collection. She is your older sister." My mother snapped her perfectly manicured fingers, gesturing sharply in the air. "It is your duty to support her. Madison has a certain image to maintain. She was building a network. You were just sitting in your room playing with computers. We asked for a simple contribution to the household, and instead of stepping up, you ran away in the middle of the night like a coward. You literally packed my bags and left them on the porch because I refused to hand over my minimum wage paychecks." I shot back, the raw sting of that memory fueling my anger. "I moved out with $50 to my name. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a shared studio apartment with 4 other girls while I taught myself coding and design. You did not call me once for 2 years, not even on my birthday." My father let out a harsh bark of laughter from his spot guarding the door. "Coding and design. Do not make me laugh. You are a homeless keyboard tapper who plays with colors on a screen. You do not have a real career. You do not have a real job. You do not even understand what it takes to build wealth in the real world. That is exactly why you have no business holding onto a property in Silicon Valley. You are entirely unfit to manage an asset of that magnitude." My mother immediately nodded in agreement, stepping closer to me. "Your father is absolutely right. You do not know the first thing about property taxes or maintenance. You probably only managed to get your name on that deed through some shady loan or by begging one of your little internet friends for help. Madison is marrying a forensic accountant. She is entering a family of real estate moguls and investment bankers. She actually knows how to manage wealth. She needs this house to prove she brings equal value to the marriage. You just need a cheap apartment and a reliable internet connection." The absolute delusion in her eyes was staggering. They had convinced themselves that I was still the helpless, obedient teenager they could bully into submission. They truly believed my career was some frivolous hobby, and that Madison, a woman who had never held down a job for more than 6 months without getting fired for sheer incompetence, was a financial genius. I looked at the quitclaim deed lying on the table. The crisp white paper demanded the surrender of everything I had sacrificed my youth to build. I thought about the endless nights staying awake until 4 in the morning, the ramen noodle dinners, the hundreds of rejection emails from investors, and the eventual triumph of securing my first major tech contract. I built an entire life from the scraps they threw away, and now they wanted to swoop in and harvest the fruits of my labor to decorate Madison and her fragile ego. Sign the paper. Riley, my mother demanded, her voice losing its fake sweetness and dropping into a harsh, guttural command. Do not ruin your sister and her wedding day with your pathetic jealousy. Give her the house. It is the absolute least you can do to repay us for raising you. I looked at my father, still blocking the heavy wooden door with his arms crossed, his chest puffed out in a display of physical intimidation. I looked at my mother, her face twisted with a greedy, desperate hunger that made her look entirely unfamiliar. They thought they had me trapped. They thought their combined verbal assault would break my spirit just like it always did when I was a child. They thought the old Riley was standing in front of them. They were very wrong. I looked down at the heavy silver fountain pen my father had thrown at me. I slowly picked it up from the glass table. My mother let out a loud, triumphant sigh of relief. My father relaxed his shoulders, a smug, victorious smile creeping onto his face as he watched me grip the silver barrel. They thought they had won. Instead of signing my name on the dotted line, I calmly placed the cap back onto the pen. The loud metallic click echoed sharply in the sudden silence of the room. I dropped the pen back onto the glass table, completely ignoring the deed. My mother's face immediately contorted with rage. What are you doing? I told you to sign it. I looked my mother dead in the eye, my posture perfectly straight, my voice devoid of any fear or hesitation. I am not signing anything, I said, my tone echoing with absolute authority. Because you are operating under a massive delusion about how I acquired that house. You think I took out a shady loan? You think I begged for help. My father stepped away from the door, his fists clenching at his sides. I do not care how you scammed your way into it. You are signing it over. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, letting a sharp, cold smile touch my lips. There is no scam, Dad. I bought that house in cash, paid in full. My mother let out a shrill, mocking laugh. In cash, you expect us to believe a keyboard tapper had $600,000 sitting in a checking account. Do not lie to us, Riley. I am not lying, I replied, staring her down until her mocking laughter faltered. I bought it in cash right after I sold the exclusive licensing rights of my financial application to Nexus Corporation. The app I designed from scratch. The app you called fake internet garbage. They paid me $2.5 million for it. That house is not a bank error, and it is certainly not family property. It is mine, and Madison will never see a single cent of it. For a fraction of a second, the sheer magnitude of the number silenced the room. My mother's jaw actually dropped, her perfectly glossed lips parting in shock as the words $2.5 million registered in her mind. My father took a slow step backward, the aggressive posture deflating as his eyes darted from my face to the quitclaim deed on the table. But in my family, greed always eclipsed shame. The shock vanished from my mother's face, instantly replaced by a hardened, opportunistic glare. She stepped right up to me, the scent of her heavy perfume almost suffocating in the enclosed space. If you have $2.5 million sitting in the bank, then giving up a $600,000 house should be absolutely nothing to you, she said, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. You are standing here fighting us over pocket change when your sister needs you. You have always been such a selfish brat, Riley, always hoarding everything for yourself while Madison struggles to make ends meet. I stared at her, genuinely amazed at the Olympic-level mental gymnastics she was performing. Struggles, I asked, my voice deadly calm. Madison has not worked a single honest day in her life. She spends her time going to day spas and racking up debt on your credit cards. I worked 3 jobs to fund my own life, and you call me selfish. My mother slammed her champagne flute down on the vanity, spilling pale golden liquid across the marble surface. Because you abandoned us, she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. You ran away when you were 18 years old. You left this family high and dry when we needed you most. Madison was going through a very difficult transition period, and you just packed your bags and walked out like a coward. A difficult transition period? I repeated, shaking my head in total disbelief. Is that what we are calling it now, Mom? She maxed out 3 different credit cards in your name to buy designer handbags and luxury resort vacations. You and Dad cornered me in the kitchen and told me I had to drop out of community college. You demanded I take double shifts at the diner so I could pay off her $30,000 debt. You wanted me to sacrifice my education to fund her shopping addiction. She needed those clothes for networking. My mother fired back, not an ounce of hesitation in her voice. Madison was building connections. She was securing a future for this family. What were you doing, sitting in a dark room staring at a computer screen? You were just a homeless keyboard tapper with no ambition and no social skills. We asked you to make one small sacrifice for the greater good of this family, and you turned your back on your own blood. The absolute delusion was suffocating. I looked at my father, who was nodding along with every word she said. They had completely rewritten history to cast Madison as the struggling heroine and me as the treacherous villain. They honestly believed that my entire purpose on this earth was to serve as a human automated teller machine for my older sister. You call me a keyboard tapper, I said, taking a deliberate step toward her. But that keyboard tapping just made me a multi-millionaire. While Madison was out networking and pretending to be rich, I was actually building wealth. I created a product from scratch. I designed the user interface, I coded the back-end software, and I negotiated the corporate buyout entirely on my own. I did not need your money, and I certainly did not need your networking. That was just pure luck, my mother scoffed, waving her hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. Anyone can get lucky on the internet. That does not mean you know how to handle real money or real property. You are completely unfit to own a home in Silicon Valley. You do not even go to galas or host charity dinners. What good is a house like that if you are just going to hide inside it? Madison is marrying Dion today. She is entering a family of elite forensic accountants and corporate lawyers. She actually knows how to utilize a property like that to elevate our family name. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my throat. Elevate our family name. You are willing to steal from me to elevate a name that means absolutely nothing. You do not care about me. You never have. You just want to strip me for parts so you can dress Madison up in a costume of success she did not earn. My mother grabbed my arm, her long nails digging sharply into my skin. We gave you the drive to succeed, Riley. If we had not pushed you out of the nest, you never would have worked so hard to prove us wrong. You owe your entire success to our parenting. Giving Madison this house is the absolute least you can do to pay us back for the trauma you caused by abandoning us. You have millions of dollars now. Stop being a greedy little child and sign the paper. She reached out, grabbed the silver fountain pen from the glass table, and shoved it aggressively against my chest. Her eyes were wide, manic, completely consumed by the sudden realization that there was millions of dollars within her reach. She was not just demanding the house anymore. She was demanding my entire submission. I looked down at the silver pen pressing into my silk dress. I slowly raised my hand, but I did not take the pen. Instead, I wrapped my fingers around her wrist and forcefully removed her hand from my body. I let her wrist drop, stepping back to create a solid boundary between us. I am not signing the deed, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that finally made her step back. Because I know this has absolutely nothing to do with Madison needing a wedding gift. I know exactly why you are so desperate to get your hands on a $600,000 asset today, and I know it has nothing to do with Dion family expecting a dowry. My father's face suddenly went pale. He shot a panicked look at my mother, who froze, the silver pen trembling in her hand. You think you are so smart? I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. You think you can bully me into signing over my property without me checking the title, or looking into why my parents are suddenly sweating through their expensive clothes? I know the truth about what is really happening behind closed doors. Before my mother could even formulate a lie to defend her sudden panic, a sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the adjoining dressing area. The heavy velvet curtain was pushed aside, and my sister Madison stormed into the main suite. She looked breathtaking in her custom bridal gown, a cascading cloud of white tulle and imported lace, but the expression twisting her features was anything but beautiful. She had clearly been listening from behind the curtain while the makeup artist pinned her veil, and the sheer jealousy radiating from her was suffocating. "Did you actually just say $2.5 million? Madison demanded, her voice shrill as she marched toward the glass vanity. "You expect us to believe that some tech company handed you millions of dollars for drawing buttons on a screen? Nexus Corporation." I corrected calmly, turning my focus to my sister. "They bought the exclusive licensing rights to the financial application I built from the ground up. The same application you laughed at when I was coding it on a mattress in a shared studio. The same application you told your friends was my pathetic excuse for being unemployed." Madison's face flushed a deep, blotchy red, clashing horribly with her pristine white gown. She snatched a full glass of red wine from the catering tray on the table, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the delicate crystal stem. "You are such a pathological liar, Riley," she spat out, taking a menacing step closer to me. "UI and UX design is a fake job. It is not a real career. You do not build anything real. You just play on your laptop all day." Dion is a forensic accountant for a top-tier investment firm. He handles real money. My friends are doctors and corporate lawyers. You are a community college dropout who could not even handle working a diner shift without complaining. There is absolutely no way you bought a $600,000 house in Silicon Valley with your own money. I stood my ground, refusing to let her towering veil and aggressive posture intimidate me. "I did not just buy the house, Madison," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I paid the property taxes for the next 5 years up front. I own it free and clear without a single cent of debt, which is a lot more than you can say for the lifestyle you have been faking for Dion family." My father stepped forward, his eyes darting between me and the quitclaim deed still sitting uselessly on the table. "If you actually have that kind of money," he interjected, his voice dripping with sudden sickening greed, "then you definitely owe this family. You stole from us to get your start." I turned to him, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of the accusation. "I stole from you?" "Yes," Madison screamed, pointing her wineglass at me so violently that a few ruby drops splashed onto the marble floor. "You stole the seed money from Mom and Dad. You must have. How else could a homeless dropout afford software licenses and hosting fees? You drained their savings to fund your stupid little tech project, and now you are trying to hide the profits from the very people who financed it. You are trying to ruin my wedding day because you are obsessed with ruining my life." The absolute absurdity of her claim made my pulse hammer in my ears. I took a step toward my sister, closing the distance until we were inches apart. "Let us get the facts straight, Madison," I said, my voice sharp and loud enough to make her flinch. "I funded my startup by working 3 jobs. I slept 4 hours a night for 3 years. I ate rice and beans while you were swiping Mom and Dad credit cards to buy VIP tables at clubs you could not afford. I never took a single dime from them. In fact, the only reason they have 0 savings left is because they remortgaged their own house twice just to cover the debts you accumulated trying to pretend you were a socialite." "Shut up!" Madison shrieked, her eyes darting nervously toward the main door, terrified that someone from Dion family might hear the truth. "I will not shut up," I fired back, the years of suppressed rage finally breaking free. "You are standing here in a dress that costs more than my first car, demanding I hand over my home so you can continue to lie to your future husband. You told Dion family that you are an independent, successful woman. You told them you were bringing assets into this marriage. But you have nothing. You are 30 years old and you have absolutely nothing to your name except a mountain of hidden credit card debt and a fake job title you put on your social media profiles." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "How dare you speak to your sister that way on her wedding day? She is the bride. You are supposed to be supporting her." "Supporting her?" I asked, my gaze shifting between the 3 of them. "My entire life has been sacrificed on the altar of supporting Madison. I am done. I am not giving you my house. I am not giving you a single penny of my money. And if you push me one more time, I will walk right out those mahogany doors and tell Dion affluent, highly educated family exactly where your dowry was supposed to come from. I will tell his mother exactly how you treat the people around you. Madison's breath hitched. She looked at my face, realizing the power dynamic of our entire lives had permanently shifted. I held all the cards, and her house of lies was at my mercy. Blinded by pure, unadulterated rage and toxic entitlement, she hurled her full glass of red wine directly at my custom-made silk dress. The cold crimson liquid hit my chest with a heavy splash, immediately soaking through the delicate fabric and spreading in an ugly, jagged stain across the pale silk. The shock of the cold wine made me gasp, the sharp scent of fermented grapes filling the air between us. I looked down at the ruined fabric, the dark red dripping onto my matching heels and pooling on the pristine white marble floor. The bridal suite went dead silent for a fraction of a second, save for the steady drip of wine hitting the stone. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with my sister. Madison was breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath the intricate lace of her bodice. Her hand was still raised in the air, the empty crystal glass shaking slightly in her grip. But the panic that should have followed such an erratic outburst never came. Instead, a twisted, deeply satisfied smirk spread across her face. She lowered the glass, crossing her arms over her chest, thoroughly pleased with her own maliciousness. I turned my gaze to my parents, waiting for the inevitable reprimand. Surely throwing wine at a wedding guest, let alone family, would cross a line even for them. I was wrong. My mother did not gasp in horror. She did not rush over with a towel or offer a single word of apology for her eldest daughter's behavior. Patricia simply picked up her own champagne flute, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked at me with absolute disdain. "You brought that entirely on yourself, Riley," my mother stated, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "If you had not marched in here spouting such disrespectful nonsense on your sister's special day, this never would have happened. You provoked her." What did you expect? I stood there, wine dripping from my hem, genuinely paralyzed by the sheer toxicity of her logic. "You are blaming me for her throwing a drink in my face," I asked, the absurdity of the situation making my voice shake. My father stepped forward, his heavy dress shoes crunching against a stray ice cube on the floor. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at my chest. "Your mother is absolutely right. You walked into this room with a chip on your shoulder, trying to overshadow Madison with your fake success stories and your selfish refusal to help this family. You earned that stain. Now go to the bathroom, clean yourself up, sign that quitclaim deed, and get out of our sight before you do any more damage to this wedding." Madison stepped out from behind our parents, her confidence completely restored by their unwavering defense of her terrible behavior. "You look exactly like the cheap trash you really are, Riley," she sneered, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "You can lie about selling apps and buying million-dollar houses all you want, but at the end of the day, you are just a bitter, jealous little girl who cannot stand the fact that I am marrying into a better life. That dress probably came from a discount rack anyway. You should thank me for giving it some color." The sheer level of delusion was almost impressive. For 26 years, I had held on to a tiny, pathetic shred of hope that someday my family would see me, that someday my hard work would outweigh their blinding favoritism, that someday they would love me just a fraction as much as they loved Madison. As I stood shivering in a wine-soaked dress while my own parents defended my abuser, that final desperate piece of hope shattered into a million irreversible pieces. They were never going to change. They were emotional vampires entirely willing to drain me dry to feed Madison endless hunger for validation. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality wash over me. The anger that had been boiling inside me vanished, replaced by a crystalline, absolute calm. I did not need to scream. I did not need to throw a glass back at her. I just needed to let them dig their own graves. Before I could utter a single word in response to her cheap trash comment, the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door clicked loudly. The heavy door swung open, revealing the bustling corridor outside. The jazz music from the reception hall temporarily swelled into the room before being abruptly cut off as the door closed again. Standing in the entryway was Josephine Washington. Dion's mother was a woman who commanded respect without ever having to raise her voice. She was the matriarch of a highly influential real estate dynasty, known equally for her ruthless business acumen and her impeccable taste. Josephine stood tall, draped in a custom-tailored emerald green suit that screamed old money, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture radiating an intimidating level of authority. She was the exact type of woman my mother desperately wanted to be, and the exact type of woman Madison was terrified of disappointing. The power dynamic in the bridal suite flipped so violently it practically caused whiplash. My mother immediately plastered on a sickeningly sweet, overly enthusiastic smile, rushing forward, as if she had not just been extorting her youngest daughter seconds prior. "Josephine," she gushed, her voice jumping up an octave. "What a wonderful surprise. We were just finishing up some last-minute sisterly bonding. Madison looks absolutely stunning, does she not?" My father stood up straighter, attempting to look dignified and welcoming. Madison quickly hid the empty wineglass behind a floral arrangement, smoothing down her white skirts and forcing a wide, innocent smile onto her face. "Oh, Mrs. Washington," Madison chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sugar. "We are so excited. Everything is just perfect." Josephine did not smile back. She did not return my mother greeting. Her piercing brown eyes swept across the room, taking in the spilled wine on the floor, the heavy tension hanging in the air, the discarded quitclaim deed resting on the glass table, and finally my ruined figure standing near the vanity. She walked slowly into the center of the room, her presence dominating the space. She completely ignored my parents' fawning attempts at conversation. She walked right past Madison, not even acknowledging the bride in her elaborate gown. Josephine stepped past Madison, looked at Riley's stained dress, and said loudly, "Oh my God, Madison! Did you just throw wine on the limited edition $15,000 Oscar de la Renta gown that I personally helped Riley pick out?" The bridal suite plunged into a silence so absolute I could hear the faint ticking of my father's expensive watch. My mother's jaw unhinged, her glass of champagne hovering suspended in midair. Madison looked as though all the blood had been violently siphoned from her body, her face turning the exact shade of the white tulle she was wearing. My father, ever the arrogant opportunist, was the first to attempt damage control. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded painfully forced, stepping forward to block Josephine's line of sight to the ruined silk. His face flushed a deep crimson, and beads of sweat began to form on his forehead as he tried to construct a plausible lie on the spot. "Josephine, what a wonderful and unexpected pleasure to see you," Richard said, rubbing his hands together with a nervous, frantic energy. "I'm afraid there has been a tiny misunderstanding here. You must have Riley confused with one of Madison's wealthy bridal party friends. Riley does not own anything from Oscar de la Renta. She is a bit of a bargain shopper. That dress is just a cheap knockoff she bought online to try and impress your family today. We were just reprimanding her for it." Patricia immediately caught on to the lie, nodding vigorously and stepping right up beside him to form a united front. "Exactly," she chirped, her voice trembling slightly beneath the fake cheer. "We love Riley, but she has a terrible habit of pretending to be something she is not. She dropped out of community college years ago. She is just wearing a cheap replica to fit in with Dion's wonderful crowd. It is actually quite embarrassing that she would wear a fake to such a prestigious event." Madison was just rightfully upset by the disrespect. I did not scream. I did not need to defend myself with loud declarations or angry gestures. I just reached into my clutch and pulled out two very important items. I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the digital receipt from my personal email, and held it alongside my solid titanium Centurion American Express card. The sleek black metal caught the light of the chandelier overhead. My mother gasped, finally recognizing the exclusive credit card she had only ever read about in magazines. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension of the room like a freshly sharpened blade, "I do not buy replicas. I bought this custom piece exactly 4 weeks ago during a private fitting at the New York flagship store. Josephine and I had lunch at Le Bernardin right beforehand to celebrate my company acquisition. Here's the receipt, paid in full, $15,000 plus tax." I held the glowing screen out toward my father. His eyes tracked the staggering total, the official Oscar de la Renta letterhead, and the last 4 digits matching the heavy black card resting in my palm. The arrogant smirk completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He tried to form words, but his mouth just opened and closed silently like a fish out of water. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the vanity chair. Josephine stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, and looked at my parents with a gaze so cold it could freeze boiling water. She adjusted the cuffs of her emerald green suit, exuding an effortless power that made my parents look like frightened children. I do not make mistakes regarding fashion, and I certainly do not make mistakes regarding people, Josephine said, her voice echoing with unmistakable authority. I built my real estate firm from a single run-down office building in Brooklyn. I spent 20 years fighting tooth and nail in boardrooms full of men who underestimated me. I know exactly what it takes to build an empire from absolute scratch. Because of that, I despise fakes, Richard. Whether it is a fake designer gown, a fake business portfolio, or fake people trying to social climb their way into my family circle. Josephine turned her head slightly, shooting a look of pure disgust at my mother, who was now visibly trembling. Riley and I met at a Women in Technology Summit last year. She was the keynote speaker, and I was an investor looking for brilliant new talent. We bonded over our shared history of fighting for every inch of ground we stand on. I respect your youngest daughter because she possesses the one trait I value above all else. She is entirely self-made. She earned every single dollar in her bank account through relentless hard work and sheer brilliance. She is exactly the kind of woman I wanted Madison to emulate. I thought her older sister would share those same values. But looking at this pathetic display, looking at you defending a grown woman throwing a temper tantrum and ruining a masterpiece, I see exactly where Madison gets her fraudulent tendencies. The air in the room was entirely sucked out. My mother clutched her pearls, physically backing away from the raw power radiating from Dion Mother. She looked entirely defeated, her grand illusion of high society superiority crumbling to dust. Madison was shaking violently, her hands gripping the edges of her bridal gown, as if it were a life raft in a sinking ship. She had spent the last 2 years feeding the Washington family a carefully curated fantasy about her own success, her imaginary wealth, and her prestigious upbringing. She had lied about her career, lied about her assets, and lied about her family dynamics. Now the architect of that fantasy was standing right in front of her, tearing the entire facade to shreds. Josephine walked slowly toward the center of the bridal suite. Her sharp eyes scanned the wreckage of the confrontation, eventually landing on the glass coffee table. She looked at the heavy silver fountain pen my father had wielded like a weapon just minutes prior, and then she looked directly at the document resting beneath it. The bold black letters spelling out quitclaim deed were impossible to miss even from a distance. She reached out and picked up the legal document. Her eyes scanned the property address in Silicon Valley, the transfer details explicitly placing Madison as the grantee, and the blank signature line waiting for my name. The silence stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds as the brilliant, sharp-witted businesswoman pieced the entire puzzle together. She saw the extortion for exactly what it was. She slowly lowered the paper, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, calculating slits. She turned her piercing gaze directly to Madison, ignoring my terrified parents entirely. Madison. Josephine began, her voice dangerously quiet, slicing through the remaining tension in the room like a scalpel. For the past 6 months, you have repeatedly assured my son and my financial planners that you were bringing a $600,000 Silicon Valley property into this marriage as part of your personal portfolio. You claimed you bought it yourself with the profits from your highly successful consulting business. So tell me, why am I holding a deed demanding that your younger sister transfer that exact property into your name 30 minutes before the ceremony? Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The pristine bridal image she had so carefully crafted was melting away, leaving behind a terrified, cornered fraud. The color had completely drained from her cheeks, making her heavy bridal makeup look garish and severe under the bright vanity lights. She stared at the quitclaim deed in Josephine's hand as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. Josephine took a step closer to the bride, her emerald green suit radiating an imposing, unyielding authority. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Her quiet tone commanded absolute obedience. Wait, Madison, you told me Riley was your unemployed sister living off your charity. You said you bought that tech hub house yourself. You sat in my dining room, drank my vintage Bordeaux, and spun an elaborate tale about how you used the profits from your independent consulting firm to secure a piece of premium Silicon Valley real estate. You assured my financial planners that this asset would be fully integrated into the marital trust. Now I find your father blocking a door and forcing your sister to sign over the very property you claimed you already owned. Explain this to me right now. The sheer force of Josephine's presence caused Madison to physically shrink back against the mirrored wall. She opened her mouth to stutter a response, but her brain completely short-circuited. Before Madison could accidentally confess to her months of pathological lying, my mother threw herself into the line of fire. Patricia lunged forward, wedging herself between Josephine and the trembling bride. The elegant, confident facade my mother usually wore was entirely gone. Sweat was visibly beading on her forehead, causing her expensive foundation to crease. She let out a high-pitched, frantic laugh that sounded like a dying bird. "Oh, Josephine, please do not jump to conclusions," my mother stammered, waving her hands in a desperate, erratic motion. "This is just a tiny misunderstanding about how high-level finance works. Madison did buy that house. She absolutely bought it with her own money. She just put it in Riley's name for tax optimization." Josephine slowly turned her head to look at my mother. Her expression was a mixture of profound disgust and genuine disbelief. "Tax optimization?" Josephine repeated, her tone dripping with lethal skepticism. My father immediately rushed in to back up the lie, adjusting his tie with sweaty, trembling fingers. "Yes, exactly. You know how the government punishes successful entrepreneurs. Madison Consulting Firm was generating so much revenue that her tax bracket became a massive burden. Riley had zero income. She was completely unemployed at the time, so it simply made financial sense to park the real estate asset under Riley's name to avoid exorbitant capital gains taxes. We are just doing the paperwork now to consolidate Madison assets back under her own name before she signs the marriage certificate. We wanted everything to be perfectly clean for Dion." The audacity of the lie was so spectacular it almost left me breathless. They were standing in front of a woman who had built a billion-dollar real estate empire from a single rundown office building in Brooklyn. Josephine understood property law, asset management, and tax codes better than anyone else in the state. Trying to gaslight her with a poorly constructed lie about bracket shifting was like trying to teach a shark how to swim. Josephine's eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. She looked at my parents, realizing in real time that she was dealing with a family of pathological liars. I did not let Josephine tear into their pathetic logic. I decided it was time to end the ping-pong match and turn the dialogue into a complete slaughter. "Let us look at some actual facts," I said smoothly, pulling my phone from my clutch and stepping forward. I unlocked the screen and opened my secure banking application. My parents flinched as if I had pulled a weapon on them. I turned the screen toward Josephine, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who was about to become my sister's worst nightmare. "I purchased the property at exactly 10 in the morning on August 14th, 3 years ago." I stated, my voice ringing with cold, verifiable truth. The total purchase price was $612,000. As you can see right here on my bank statement, those funds were wired directly from my personal account. That account was funded entirely by a $2.5 million wire transfer from Nexus Corporation, which cleared exactly 4 days prior. Josephine adjusted her reading glasses, leaning in to verify the digital bank records. She nodded slowly, her sharp eyes taking in the undeniable proof of my wealth. My father's face turned a sickly shade of purple. "She hacked those documents," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She is a computer person. She knows how to fake numbers on a screen." Madison gave her the seed money in cash. I let out a harsh, echoing laugh that silenced his frantic yelling. Madison gave me cash, I asked, turning my gaze directly to my sister. 3 years ago, Madison was not running a highly successful consulting firm. 3 years ago, Madison had just been evicted from her luxury apartment because she spent her rent money on designer shoes. She moved back into your basement and worked the front desk at a luxury car dealership until she got fired for chronic tardiness. Her car was repossessed that same summer. Are you seriously trying to convince a real estate mogul that a woman with a negative credit score and zero income was sheltering a $600,000 asset in Silicon Valley? Patricia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she tried to physically silence me. "Shut your mouth, Riley," she hissed, completely abandoning her sweet society persona. "You are ruining your sister's life. You are twisting the narrative." I yanked my arm out of her grasp with so much force that she stumbled backward. "I am not twisting anything," I said, staring my mother down. "I am just providing the background check you clearly failed to run on your own daughter. You want to talk about tax optimization?" I smiled a wide, predatory grin that made Madison physically recoil. Tax optimization. Mom, did you forget Madison was fired from her real estate firm last year for stealing client data? Stealing client data. Josephine repeated the words, dropping like heavy anvils onto the pristine marble floor. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profound. The air in the room stretched out taut and heavy like a wire about to snap. Madison's eyes darted frantically between me, our parents, and Josephine, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. Then the dam finally broke. Madison let out a guttural, jagged shriek that sounded less like a human and more like a cornered animal. The carefully constructed facade of the elegant, affluent bride completely disintegrated, leaving behind a frantic, terrified fraud whose entire world was collapsing in real time. She lunged forward, her expensive tulle veil catching on the sharp edge of the vanity chair and tearing with a loud, sickening rip. She did not even seem to notice the destruction of her perfect outfit, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Shut your lying mouth!" Madison screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure panic. She waved her arms erratically, turning toward Josephine with wild, desperate eyes. "She is making it up. It was a complete misunderstanding, Josephine. I swear to you, I just borrowed a flash drive to work from home, and the firm completely overreacted because of office politics. Riley is a jealous, pathological liar trying to ruin my wedding because she has absolutely nothing else going for her." Josephine did not flinch. She did not offer a comforting smile or a reassuring touch. She simply took one deliberate step back, her posture rigid with utter revulsion. She looked at Madison not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a severe toxic liability. "You lied about your career," Josephine stated, her voice as sharp and cold as shattered glass. "You lied about your assets, you lied about your family wealth, and you just attempted to legally extort your own sister to cover your fraudulent tracks. There is no misunderstanding here, Madison. There is only undeniable deception." The realization that Josephine was completely impervious to her tears sent Madison into a full, unhinged meltdown. She began pacing the room, her breathing shallow and ragged, her hands clutching the sides of her head and pulling at her hair, ruining her elaborate bridal updo. Bejeweled hairpins clattered uselessly to the floor. The wealthy, prestigious life she had manipulated her way into was rapidly slipping through her trembling fingers, and the sheer terror of losing her golden ticket made her dangerous. "Security!" Madison shrieked at the top of her lungs, her vocal cords straining as she spun toward the hallway. "Get security in here right now! Remove this crazy woman! She is trespassing. Get her out of my wedding before she ruins everything." My father and mother exchanged a look of sheer, frantic desperation. The words were no longer working. The gaslighting had failed spectacularly. Josephine was not buying their lies, and my presence in the room was a ticking time bomb of truth that threatened to destroy their only chance at aligning themselves with the Washington dynasty. They needed me gone immediately and by any means necessary. Richard lunged forward, his heavy, sweaty hands clamping down hard onto my shoulders. Patricia flanked him, grabbing my left arm with fingers that dug into my skin like talons. Together, they attempted to physically corral me toward the rear exit of the bridal suite, a discreet service door used by the catering staff. "Move, Riley. My father hissed his face inches from mine, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee and panic. You have done enough damage for one lifetime. Get out the back door right now before I throw you out into the alley myself. You are destroying your sister's future. Patricia wept her tears, a mixture of actual panic and calculated manipulation. Just leave, walk away, and let us fix this mess. I did not cower. I did not let their sudden physical aggression intimidate me. The days of me shrinking away from their anger were long gone. I planted my heels firmly against the marble floor, refusing to be shoved aside like an unwanted piece of luggage. A fiery surge of adrenaline pumped through my veins. I shoved my father's chest hard enough to make him stumble backward in surprise, and I ripped my arm out of my mother's grasping claws. Do not ever put your hands on me again, I warned, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register that commanded the space. I stopped letting you push me around the day I walked out of your front door at 18, with exactly $50 in my pocket. You laughed at me. You told me I would starve in the real world. You told me I would come crawling back on my hands and knees begging for your help. Instead, I ate rice and beans, worked myself to the bone, and built an empire from the ground up while you coddled a thief. I smoothed down the silk of my ruined dress, my chin held high. I am not moving. I am not running out the back door to save your reputations. You built this house of lies, and now you are going to stand here and watch it burn to the ground. Before my parents could attempt to grab me again, heavy, rapid footsteps echoed down the corridor. Two massive security guards dressed in crisp black suits with earpieces curled around their ears burst into the bridal suite. Their eyes darted around the chaotic scene, taking in the spilled wine, the torn veil, and the heavy tension suffocating the room. Madison immediately pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest, her face stained with ruined makeup and frantic tears. Grab her and throw her out onto the street right now. She assaulted me. She is trying to ruin my wedding. The guards exchanged a brief look of professional compliance and stepped forward, their massive hands reaching out to grab my arms and forcibly drag me out of the suite. I braced myself, entirely prepared to fight them off if necessary. But before their hands could even graze the fabric of my dress, a towering figure filled the open doorway, completely blocking their path. It was Dion. The two burly men froze, their hands hovering mere inches from my arms. They looked from me to the imposing figure standing in the doorway, clearly conflicted. Dion did not look like a man moments away from walking down the aisle. The tailored tuxedo jacket he should have been wearing was nowhere to be seen. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the silk bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. He had rolled his sleeves up to his forearms, revealing the tense corded muscles beneath his skin. His jaw was set like granite, and his eyes swept the room with the cold, calculating precision of a predator assessing a trap. Tucked securely under his left arm was a thick, bulging red legal folder. "Stand down!" Dion commanded, his voice perfectly level but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. The guards immediately recognized the groom, the man whose signature was on the checks paying their hourly rate. They exchanged a swift glance, gave a sharp nod, and backed away from me, retreating quickly into the hallway and pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind them. The metallic click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the bridal suite. My mother was the first to attempt to salvage the rapidly disintegrating situation. Patricia threw herself forward, completely abandoning her previous aggression toward me. She slapped on a mask of radiant, panicked joy, her eyes wide and manic, as she rushed toward her future son-in-law. She desperately tried to block his view of the spilled wine, the torn veil, and my ruined silk dress. "Dion, darling." Patricia gasped, her voice shrill and trembling as she reached out to grab his arm. "What are you doing in here? You know, it is incredibly bad luck to see the bride before she walks down the aisle. You need to leave right now, sweetie. We were just dealing with a tiny bit of pre-wedding jitters. Riley is overly emotional today, and she was just on her way out. Let us preserve the magic for the altar, all right?" My father quickly flanked her, attempting to project a calm, masculine solidarity. "Exactly," Dion Richard chuckled, running a sweaty hand through his thinning hair. "Just some standard sibling rivalry boiling over. You know how highly strung women get during these events. We are handling it. Nothing for you to worry your head about. Why don't you head back to the groomsmen's suite? Dion did not smile. He did not agree. He did not even look at them. With a chillingly calm demeanor, Dion stepped sideways, completely bypassing my parents, as if they were nothing more than insignificant pieces of furniture. Patricia's hands grasped at empty air. Richard's forced laughter died in his throat. Dion ignored them with a level of absolute dismissive contempt that left them both standing paralyzed in the center of the room. He walked straight toward me, his dark eyes scanning my face, before trailing down to the massive crimson stain splashed across my gown. "Are you all right, Riley?" Dion asked, his voice entirely devoid of the frantic energy consuming the rest of the room. He spoke to me with a quiet, grounded respect. I met his gaze, refusing to let the adrenaline make me shake. "I am perfectly fine, Dion," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Just a ruined dress and a lot of wasted breath." I told them I wasn't moving, and I meant it. Dion gave me a short, approving nod. He respected facts, and he respected people who did not back down. He then slowly rotated his body, turning his attention away from me and focusing entirely on his bride. Madison was hyperventilating. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, jerky movements beneath her heavily beaded bodice. The tears streaking her face were no longer a calculated manipulation. They were the genuine, terrified tears of a woman realizing her entire world was collapsing. She took a hesitant step toward him, holding her hands out pleadingly. "Dion, baby, please!" Madison sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Riley is trying to ruin our day. She came in here screaming and attacking me. She is jealous of us. She is making up horrible, crazy lies to your mother. You have to believe me. Tell them to make her leave." Dion did not move to comfort her. He did not reach out to wipe away her tears or wrap his arms around her shaking frame. He simply stared at her with a dead-eyed, unblinking intensity that made the temperature in the room plummet. As a forensic accountant for a top-tier investment firm, Dion spent his life dissecting financial discrepancies, hunting down hidden assets, and exposing corporate fraud. He tracked money for a living, and money never lied. People did. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry, dissecting her panic, with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to a fraudulent ledger. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating as Madison slowly lowered her trembling hands, realizing her tears held absolutely zero power over him. Dion walked slowly over to the glass coffee table, stepping precisely around the puddle of red wine on the marble floor. He glanced briefly at his mother Josephine, who stood silently near the vanity. They exchanged a single, imperceptible nod. The trap had already been set, and my family had walked right into it blindly. Dion unrolled his arm and took the thick red legal folder he had been carrying. He held it over the center of the glass table for a fraction of a second. Dion drops the heavy folder onto the glass table with a loud thud and says, "Nobody is kicking Riley out. Madison, we need to have a serious talk about your parents' hidden bank accounts." The silence that followed Dion's declaration was so profound, it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked entirely out of the room. Madison stared at the thick red folder resting on the glass table as if it were an unexploded bomb. Her mouth opened and closed, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The manic, aggressive energy that had fueled her screaming fit just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by the paralyzing grip of absolute terror. Dion did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority commanded the space entirely. He stood tall, his rolled-up sleeves revealing forearms corded with tension. His dark eyes locked onto the woman he had almost married. "You told me you were an independent consultant, Madison. You told me your real estate firm let you go because of corporate downsizing. You told me that applying for a joint mortgage was a mere formality for our future together." Madison swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. "Dion, honey, I can explain everything. It is just a big misunderstanding about my credit score." "Do not insult my intelligence," Dion interrupted, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. I am a senior forensic accountant for one of the largest investment funds in the country. My entire career is built on tracking missing money, exposing fraudulent asset structures, and dismantling corporate embezzlement schemes. I analyze financial discrepancies for a living. Did you honestly believe you could hand over your social security number for a rigorous mortgage background check? And I would not notice the glaring anomalies? Patricia clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically toward the door, as if hoping the security guards might magically return to save them. Dion, please, she stammered, her voice shaking. We are family now. We can discuss these private matters later, away from all this stress. We are not family, Patricia Dion stated flatly, not even bothering to look at her. And this stopped being a private matter the second I discovered the extensive network of lies your daughter spun to trap me into a marriage. When the bank flagged Madison's application due to a massive unexplained debt-to-income ratio, I decided to do what I do best. I pulled a few professional strings. I ran a deep dive audit not just on Madison, but on the entire family structure. I needed to know exactly who I was binding myself to, legally and financially. Richard's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. The initial panic in his eyes was rapidly transforming into the defensive bluster of a man accustomed to bullying his way out of trouble. He puffed out his chest and took an aggressive step toward Dion, attempting to leverage his age and supposed patriarchal authority. Now you listen to me, Richard barked, pointing a thick finger at Dion. You have absolutely no right to poke your nose into my personal finances. That is a gross violation of our family privacy. We are upstanding citizens. Whatever you think you found in those files is none of your business. I demand you hand over that folder right now and apologize to my daughter, or I will have my lawyers sue you for unauthorized access to confidential records. Dion did not back down. He actually took a step closer to Richard, closing the distance, until my father was forced to crane his neck slightly to meet the younger man's intense gaze. The absolute lack of intimidation in Dion's posture made Richard visibly falter. Family privacy. Dion repeated, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping his lips. You forfeit the right to privacy when you use illegal shell companies to launder stolen money, Richard. The blood drained completely from Richard's face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. Do not try to play the outraged patriarch with me. Dion continued, his voice sharp and precise, delivering each word like a surgical strike. I traced the wire transfers. I know exactly how you operate. You set up 3 separate limited liability companies registered in Delaware under your wife's maiden name. You used those shell companies to funnel capital into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But you were sloppy. You linked the primary offshore account to the exact same domestic routing number Madison used to pay off her repossessed car 2 years ago. Richard opened his mouth to deny it, but Dion cut him off, relentless and unyielding. I tracked the cash flow, Richard. The deposits into your offshore accounts perfectly align with the dates Madison was accused of stealing client data from her former real estate firm. She did not just take contact lists. She stole sensitive financial profiles, intercepted escrow deposits, and funneled the stolen capital directly into your Delaware shell companies to be laundered. Your daughter is not an independent consultant. She is a corporate thief, and you are her money launderer. Madison let out a small, strangled whimper, her hands covering her face as she sank down onto the edge of the velvet vanity stool. The beautiful bridal suite had transformed into an interrogation room, and there was no escape. Patricia sank against the mirrored wall, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently. She looked at Richard for a lifeline, but my father was staring at Dion with the vacant, wide eyes of a man watching a firing squad take aim. You thought you could marry her off to me, Dion said, his gaze shifting back to the weeping bride. You thought that by tying yourselves to my family wealth, you could quietly cover the massive holes in your accounts before the federal investigators caught up with the missing escrow funds. You thought I would just sign the marriage certificate, merge our assets, and unknowingly become a shield for your federal crimes. Josephine stood quietly in the background, her arms crossed over her emerald green suit, her expression radiating cold, calculating approval. She watched her son dismantle the fraudulent family piece by piece, her silence acting as an impenetrable wall of support. I stood rooted to the spot, my ruined silk dress completely forgotten. I had always known my parents were financially irresponsible and obsessed with appearances, and I knew Madison was a liar. But the sheer scale of their deception, the orchestrated illegal depths they had sunk to in order to maintain their wealthy facade, left me momentarily breathless. They had not just stolen from me, they had stolen from innocent clients and attempted to con a financial expert. Dion reached down and placed his hand on the thick red folder resting on the glass table. The room held its collective breath. The ambient hum of the hotel air conditioning system seemed deafening in the heavy silence. I did not just bring this folder to cancel a wedding. Dion stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. I brought it to show you exactly what happens when you try to con a forensic accountant. With a swift, fluid motion, Dion flipped the heavy folder open. The pages inside were filled with dense spreadsheets, highlighted bank routing numbers, and complex financial flowcharts. He tapped his index finger sharply against the top page, directly onto a terrifying number circled in thick red ink. -$1,200,000. The bold red ink seemed to bleed off the pristine white page, screaming the reality of my parents' financial ruin. I stared at the number, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "That is your true net worth," Richard Dion said, his voice echoing with lethal calm in the cavernous bridal suite. "You owe $1.2 million. But the most fascinating part of my audit was discovering exactly who holds that debt. You do not owe this money to major banks or traditional lending institutions. You owe it to shadow investors, illegal sports betting syndicates, and offshore gambling rings." Richard staggered backward until his shoulders hit the mirrored wall. The arrogant, imposing father who had spent his life dictating my worth had completely vanished. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow. Dion leaned over the table, refusing to give him a single second to recover. "You are not wealthy suburbanites. You do not belong to the elite social class you pretend to rule. Your entire life is a terrifying house of cards built on underground poker games, massive sports bets, and loan sharks who charge exorbitant illegal interest rates. You laundered Madison's stolen corporate funds just to make the minimum monthly interest payments to men who break bones when they do not get their money." The sheer gravity of the situation slammed into me. This was not just poor financial management. This was an addiction, a reckless criminal desperation that had compromised our entire family. "Madison was your ultimate bailout strategy." Dion continued, turning his dead-eyed stare toward my sister, who was currently curled into a miserable, shaking ball on the vanity stool. "You groomed her to marry into my family because you knew the Washington dynasty had the kind of liquid capital required to erase your mistakes. You thought my family trust fund was your personal piggy bank. You thought you could smile pose for wedding photos and secretly bleed my accounts dry to pay off your underground debt." Patricia let out a guttural, wounded wail and collapsed onto her knees. The expensive silk of her mother of the bride gown pooled around her on the marble floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as she launched into her favorite role, the helpless, misunderstood victim. "We had no choice," Patricia sobbed, looking up at Dion with mascara-stained cheeks. "The economy ruined us. The housing market crashed. Richard, investments failed, and we just wanted to maintain a nice life for our girls. We only wanted Madison to have the beautiful wedding she deserved. We just made a few bad financial decisions, trying to keep our heads above water." "Please, Dion, you have to understand the pressure we were under." Her pathetic tears might have worked on someone else, but they ignited a blinding, white-hot fury inside my chest. Suddenly, 20 years of memories snapped into sharp, agonizing focus. "The economy did not ruin you," I said, my voice slicing through her hysterical crying like a blade. Patricia flinched, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I stepped forward, towering over my mother as she kneeled on the floor. "You told me we could not afford a winter coat for me when I was in middle school, so I wore 3 sweaters layered on top of each other. You told me my college fund was wiped out by a bad mutual fund, forcing me to take on predatory student loans and work 3 minimum wage jobs just to survive. I ate ramen noodles and slept on a mattress on the floor, while you and Dad maintained your expensive country club memberships and hosted lavish catered dinners for your friends." My father looked away, unable to meet my eyes, confirming everything I was saying. It was never a bad economy. I continued the bitter truth settling heavily into my bones. It was never bad luck. My entire childhood of deprivation was funding your gambling addiction. You starved me of basic necessities so you could sit at underground poker tables and throw away thousands of dollars a night. You used me as a financial shock absorber while you poured everything into Madison, molding her into the perfect shiny bait to catch a wealthy husband and save yourselves. Riley, please, Patricia begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward my ankles. We love you. We were just so scared. I kicked my foot back, disgusted by the thought of her touching me. Do not use the word love. You do not know what it means. You are parasites. Josephine watched the entire exchange with silent, calculating precision. She had seen enough. She stepped forward, her emerald green suit immaculate, her posture radiating absolute authority. She picked up the crumpled quitclaim deed from the edge of the vanity where she had dropped it earlier. She held the legal document out, pinching it between her fingers as if it were contaminated with a deadly virus. Dayon looked at the deed, then shifted his gaze back to my father. The temperature in the room plummeted again. Dion was no longer just exposing a fraud. He was uncovering a crime. This brings us to the final piece of your pathetic puzzle, Dion said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory whisper. He pointed directly at the quitclaim deed dangling from his mother hand. You cornered Riley in this room, Dion said, his dark eyes locking onto Richard. You trapped her, physically blocked the exit, and tried to force her to sign away the rights to a pristine, fully paid-off premium piece of Silicon Valley real estate. Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a slow, jagged path down his temple. It was a family asset, he rasped, his voice barely functional. We just wanted to consolidate. Stop, Dion commanded, slicing his hand through the air. We both know that house is worth over $3 million today. We both know you owe $1.2 million to dangerous people. Dion took one slow, deliberate step toward my father. He dropped the heavy red folder back onto the glass table with a loud, resounding thud that made everyone in the room flinch. Nobody is kicking Riley out, Dion said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or escape. Madison, we need to have a serious talk about your parents' hidden bank accounts. Richard, what did you really intend to do with Riley House the second she signed that deed? Richard's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He glanced at the door, then at his wife, but found no salvation anywhere. The silence stretched until Dayon shattered it. Since you seem to have lost your voice, I will explain it to the room, Dion said, his tone razor-sharp. You never intended to use Riley property as a dowry or a trust asset. You needed liquid cash, and you needed it by the end of this week. Your plan was to force Riley to sign the quitclaim deed, taking immediate legal ownership of her $3 million asset. Then tomorrow morning, you were going to use that deed to secure a fraudulent high-interest hard money loan for exactly $600,000. My breath caught in my throat. $600,000. It was half the total debt Dion had just exposed. Why that specific amount? Dion asked rhetorically, his eyes pinning Richard to the wall. Because that is the exact sum of the balloon payment due to the shadow syndicate threatening your life. You were going to mortgage your own daughter house to pay off loan sharks. You planned to bleed her dry, take the fast cash, and leave her entirely responsible for a predatory loan she never agreed to. You were going to let the bank foreclose on the only home she ever owned just to keep your own kneecaps intact. The sheer predatory evil of the scheme hit me with the force of a freight train. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. I looked at the man and woman who had brought me into this world. They had starved me of affection, mocked my ambitions, and thrown me out onto the street. I had always known they were selfish, but this was different. This was not just neglect. This was a calculated sociopathic sacrifice. They viewed my survival, my hard-earned sanctuary, as nothing more than collateral to shield them from the violent consequences of their own criminal addiction. My entire childhood of wearing threadbare clothes and eating cheap noodles was not the result of a struggling economy. It was the direct result of them shoveling money onto underground gambling tables and they were willing to destroy my entire future to keep playing the game. But that only accounts for half the debt. Dion continued, his voice echoing off the marble walls, pulling my attention back to the slaughter. You still owed another 600,000, and that is where I came in. Dion turned his gaze away from Richard and aimed it directly at Madison. The second phase of the plan relied entirely on this wedding. Dion said, his words dripping with lethal disgust. Once the marriage certificate was signed and the assets were legally commingled, Madison was going to invent a catastrophic family emergency. A fabricated medical crisis, a sudden lawsuit, a failing business venture that required immediate discrete capital. You planned to dump the remaining debt directly onto my family using the newly forged marital bonds as emotional blackmail. You were going to extort the Washington Trust Fund under the guise of family solidarity. No, Madison shrieked, her voice tearing through the suite like a siren. She scrambled up from the vanity stool, her hands waving frantically as she physically backed away from her parents. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at Richard and Patricia. I knew nothing about this, Dion, you have to believe me. They did this. They hid their debts from me. I am just an innocent victim in their financial crimes. They manipulated me just like they manipulated Riley. I love you, Dion. I only ever wanted to marry you. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as her golden child publicly threw her to the wolves. Madison, how could you? Patricia wailed, genuine shock replacing her manufactured tears. We did everything for you. Shut up! Madison screamed back at her mother, her face an ugly mask of self-preservation. You ruined my life. You ruined my wedding. Dion, please look at me. I am your bride. I knew nothing about their offshore accounts or the loan sharks. I swear on my life. Dion did not flinch. His expression remained entirely unchanged, a portrait of cold forensic detachment. He reached down to the open red folder on the glass table. You swear on your life? Madison, Dion asked, his voice eerily quiet. Yes, I swear, she cried, clasping her hands together as if in prayer. Dion calmly pulled a single sheet of printed paper from the folder. He held it up to the light. Then let us read what you wrote. Madison froze. The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a corpse. This is an email sent from your personal account to your father exactly 4 months ago. Dion stated, his eyes scanning the text. Subject line: Washington Trust Structure. Let me read a few highlights. You wrote Dion Trust Fund unlocks 30 days after the wedding. Josephine keeps the primary assets, highly liquid, mostly in municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks. If we stage the business failure narrative right after the honeymoon, we can extract the remaining 600,000 without triggering an automatic audit from their wealth managers. I have already drafted the fake legal summons we will need to make the emergency look legitimate. Dion lowered the paper, his dark eyes locking onto Madison. You were not manipulated, Madison. You were the mastermind. You targeted my family wealth from the very beginning. You ran a financial analysis on my mother's liquidity and engineered a precise timeline for extracting the funds post-wedding. You are not an innocent victim. You are the architect of the entire extortion plot. Madison's legs gave out. She collapsed back onto the floor, her ruined wedding dress billowing around her like a deflated parachute. She opened her mouth, but only a hollow, breathless gasp escaped. The irrefutable proof of her sociopathic greed lay printed on the paper in Dion's hand. There was no spinning this. There was no gaslighting her way out. The absolute finality of her exposure hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Richard and Patricia stood frozen against the wall, trapped in the inescapable reality of their ruined lives. The Washington family wealth, their ultimate bailout, was completely out of reach. The loan sharks were waiting. The federal investigators were inevitably circling. Their golden child had turned on them, and their scapegoat daughter had exposed them. The silence that followed the reading of the email was absolute. It was the silence of total destruction. Then the sharp, authoritative click of expensive heels echoed against the marble floor. Josephine Washington stepped forward, her voice echoing with absolute authority. The wedding is canceled. Dion, call the police. The word police broke the spell of paralysis gripping the room. Total, unadulterated chaos erupted inside the bridal suite. Madison let out a visceral shriek, throwing herself across the marble floor. She crawled toward Dion, her heavily beaded gown tearing against the sharp edges of the vanity stool she knocked over in her frenzy. She grabbed him by the knees, sobbing so violently she was choking on her own breath. "Dion, please no!" Madison wailed, burying her face against his tailored trousers. "You cannot do this. I am your bride. I love you. I will do anything. I will sign a prenup. I will cut them off. Just do not call the police. They will put me in jail." Dion stared down at her with an expression of pure revulsion. He pried her fingers off his legs with clinical detachment, stepping backward to free himself from her grasp. He pulled his cell phone from his inner jacket pocket and began dialing, his eyes never leaving her tear-streaked face. Patricia, seeing Dion raising the phone to his ear, abandoned her weeping on the floor. She scrambled to her feet and sprinted toward the heavy mahogany doors of the suite. She slammed her back against the wood, spreading her arms wide like a human barricade. Her elaborate updo had partially collapsed, leaving strands of hair plastered to her sweaty neck. "Josephine, let us be reasonable," Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "We belong to the same social circles. If you call the authorities, the scandal will humiliate your family too. The press will have a field day. Think of the Washington reputation. We can settle this privately. Just give us time to liquidate some assets." Josephine slowly turned her gaze to Patricia. The older woman did not even blink. "My family reputation is built on integrity, Patricia. Yours is built on theft. Move away from that door before I have my security team remove you by force." While Patricia bargained and Madison begged, Richard remained entirely silent. He stood near the center of the room, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He was staring at Dion, who was now calmly speaking to the emergency dispatcher, relaying the hotel address, and requesting financial fraud investigators. Richard was a man who had spent his entire life bullying his way out of consequences. He had manipulated, intimidated, and stolen to maintain his facade of power. Now the walls were closing in. He was looking at the literal end of his life. The shadow investors and loan sharks he owed money to did not send collection notices. They sent men who broke bones and set fires. Federal prison was the best-case scenario for him, and violent retaliation was the worst. He was a cornered animal, completely stripped of his options. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape until they landed on me. The sheer predatory evil I saw in his face made my blood run cold. The calculation in his eyes shifted into pure, unhinged rage. He did not blame himself for stealing. He did not blame Madison for getting caught. He blamed the one person who had refused to play her designated role. "You!" Richard roared, his voice tearing from his throat like a wild beast. He lunged toward me, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "If you had just signed the paper, if you had just done what you were told, none of this would be happening." I stood my ground, refusing to let him see the fear spiking in my chest. "You are pathetic," I told him, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of adrenaline and disgust. "You were going to let me lose my home so you could pay off loan sharks. You sold out your own daughter to save your own skin. You deserve everything that is about to happen to you." "You ungrateful, selfish wretch," Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips as he closed the distance between us. "I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. You owed us that house. You ruined my life. You ruined your sister." He raised his hand as if to strike me, his fist clenched tight. "Riley, we are leaving," Josephine commanded, stepping smoothly between me and my father. She did not raise her voice, but the icy authority in her tone stopped Richard in his tracks. "Do not engage with criminals. Dion has the authorities on the line. We will wait for them in the lobby." I looked at my father one last time, feeling absolutely nothing but revulsion for the man standing before me. I gave Josephine a short nod and turned my back on Richard to walk toward the exit. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I forgot that a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. Richard, seeing his life flashing before his eyes, seeing his freedom evaporating, completely snapped. His rational mind shut down, replaced by violent, feral desperation. He needed someone to pay, and my turned back was the ultimate trigger. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden violent blur of motion. Richard spun toward the glass coffee table. He bypassed the red legal folder and grabbed the massive solid brass candle centerpiece sitting near the edge. It was a heavy ornate piece of metal, designed to hold 5 thick pillar candles weighing easily 10 pounds. His thick fingers wrapped around the brass base, his knuckles turning white with the force of his grip. "Look out," Dion yelled, dropping his phone to the marble floor. I tried to turn, tried to bring my arms up to shield my face, but I was a fraction of a second too late. Richard swung the solid brass centerpiece with the full, desperate force of a man with nothing left to lose. The heavy metal cleaved through the air and connected squarely with the side of my head. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet crack that echoed over Madison, frantic screaming. The impact felt like an explosion inside my skull. A blinding flash of white light erupted behind my eyes, followed instantly by an agony so intense it knocked the air completely out of my lungs. My equilibrium vanished. My legs folded beneath me like paper. I hit the marble floor hard, the cold stone slamming against my shoulder and hip. A high-pitched ringing sound completely deafened my left ear. Warm, thick liquid immediately began pouring down the side of my face, soaking into the collar of my ruined silk dress. Through my rapidly tunneling vision, I saw the brass centerpiece clatter to the floor, rolling through the puddle of spilled red wine. I tried to push myself up, but my arms refused to respond to my brain commands. Everything was moving in slow motion. I saw Richard standing above me, chest heaving, staring at his own hands in wild shock. Then a massive blur of motion crossed my fading field of view. Dion did not hesitate. He launched himself across the space, tackling Richard with brutal, punishing force. The two men hit the ground with a massive crash, shattering the glass coffee table into thousands of jagged pieces. I heard Josephine shouting. "Something." Heard the distant, tinny voice of the 911 operator calling out. From Dion dropped phone on the floor near my face. I tried to focus on the voices, tried to keep my eyes open, but the white-hot pain radiating through my skull was pulling me down into a dark, heavy void. The last thing I saw was Dion pulling his fist back to strike my father, and then the world went completely black. The darkness did not last long, though it felt as if I were swimming up from the very bottom of a frozen ocean. A sharp, stinging chemical burn snapped my senses back online. I gasped, my lungs pulling in air that tasted overwhelmingly of metallic copper and the suffocating, sickly sweet fragrance of Casablanca lilies. My eyelids felt like they were lined with lead, but I forced them open. The ornate, glittering chandelier of the bridal suite was gone. Instead, I was staring up at the muted, recessed lighting of a secondary holding room, lying flat on my back on a stiff, velvet sofa. 2 emergency medical technicians hovered above me. One pressed a thick, sterile gauze pad hard against my left temple, sending a fresh, blinding spike of agony straight to the core of my brain. I groaned, my hands instinctively flying up to stop him. "Stay entirely still." Miss the EMT ordered, his voice steady but urgent. "You took a massive blunt force impact to the skull. We are stabilizing the laceration, but you are showing clear signs of a severe concussion. We have an ambulance waiting at the loading dock." I tried to process his words, but the roaring in my ears made everything sound as if it were being spoken underwater. Before panic could fully set in, a firm, warm grip tightened around my right hand. I turned my head, fighting a wave of nausea, and found Josephine Washington sitting in a high-backed chair, pulled flush against the sofa. Her emerald green suit was still immaculate, save for a single dark smear of my blood staining her left cuff. She did not look disgusted or panicked. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield that had just been definitively won. "You are safe, Riley," Josephine said, her voice radiating a calm, absolute authority that anchored me to the present moment. "Breathe. Just breathe. The threat has been completely neutralized." My throat felt like sandpaper. "Where is he?" I rasped. The memory of Richard's twisted, feral face flashing in my mind. "Where is my father?" Josephine's expression hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic disdain. "The man who assaulted you is no longer a concern. Venue security pulled him off my son and dragged him out the service exit. He is currently sitting on the concrete floor of the loading dock with his wrists zip-tied together waiting for the police cruisers you can hear pulling up outside. I strained my ringing ears. Faintly through the thick walls of the hotel, the rising wail of sirens cut through the evening air. The reality of it hit me like a second physical blow. Richard was actually going to jail. The untouchable patriarch was finally facing the consequences of his own violent entitlement. And my mother, Madison, I asked, testing the limits of my throbbing jaw. I had my personal security team lock them inside the bridal suite. Josephine replied casually, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. They can enjoy the wreckage of their criminal conspiracy until the federal fraud investigators arrive to take their statements. They are going nowhere. A massive, shuddering breath escaped my chest. It was over. The suffocating weight of my family predatory demands. The years of financial gaslighting, the imminent threat of losing my home. It had all been shattered in the span of 30 minutes. But as my mind cleared, I realized a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. "Where is Dion?" I asked, gripping Josephine's hand tighter. "Is he with the police? Did Richard hurt him?" A slow, dangerous smile curved the corners of Josephine's mouth. It was a smile completely devoid of humor, radiating a fierce, terrifying pride. "My son is perfectly unharmed," Josephine stated, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "But he is not with the police. Dion does not handle betrayal quietly, Riley. He does not allow people to attempt to extort our family trust and walk away with their social standing intact." I blinked, trying to clear the blurry edges of my vision. "What does that mean? Where did he go?" Josephine leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "He picked up his red legal folder, bypassed the police dispatch entirely, and marched straight through the double doors into the grand ballroom." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The grand ballroom. There were 300 guests sitting in that room. The guest list was a meticulously curated collection of Silicon Valley elite venture capitalists, local politicians, and high society power brokers. It was the exact audience Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives trying to impress, the exact people they needed to maintain their fraudulent facade of wealth. He took the microphone. Josephine said, the satisfaction in her voice undeniable. "He is currently standing at the altar explaining to every single person in your parents' social circle exactly why the wedding is canceled. He is reading their offshore account balances, their loan shark debts, and their embezzlement schemes aloud to the crowd. He is executing their reputation permanently." The sheer ruthless brilliance of it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. Dion was not just protecting himself, he was scorching the earth. He was dismantling their fake empire brick by fraudulent brick, exposing them as the desperate thieving criminals they truly were. He was burning their pristine social standing down to the ashes. The EMT snapped a penlight on, passing the blinding beam across my pupils. "Miss, your pupils are sluggish. You need to remain prone. We are moving you to the stretcher now." I slapped his hand away. The sudden movement sent the room spinning and my stomach heaved violently, but the desperate need for closure overpowered the physical agony. I pushed my boots flat against the floor and forced myself to sit up. "Miss, you cannot stand up," the second EMT protested, reaching out to grab my shoulders. "You have suffered significant head trauma." "Get off me!" I growled, my voice rough but entirely lucid. Josephine did not try to stop me. She simply released my hand and stood up, watching me with an expression of profound, silent respect. She understood exactly what I needed to do. She knew that after a lifetime of being pushed down, silenced, and treated like collateral damage, I needed to see my abusers finally held accountable. I forced my legs to lock into place. The room tilted dangerously, but I gripped the back of the velvet sofa until the world leveled out. I could feel the warm, unmistakable dampness of fresh blood seeping through the thick white gauze wrapped around the side of my skull. It dripped down my neck, soaking into the ruined, wine-stained silk of my dress. I did not care. I turned my back on the protesting medics and staggered forward. I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the holding room door, pulling it open to the sounds of chaotic echoing murmurs spilling from the main hall. I had to see the empire fall with my own eyes. The heavy brass handle gave way with a soft, expensive click. I stepped out of the holding room and into the dimly lit corridor, connecting the private suites to the main venue. Every step sent a fresh, nauseating throb through my skull, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins acted as a chemical shield against the pain. I kept my hand pressed against the thick gauze on my temple, feeling the warm, sticky seep of blood staining my fingers, and kept walking. I slipped through the arched entryway of the grand ballroom and immediately melted into the shadows, pressing my back against a massive, fluted marble pillar. The cold stone grounded me, offering a physical anchor as the sheer scale of the room washed over me. It was a masterpiece of opulent excess. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers. 300 gold chivari chairs sat around tables draped in imported silk. This was the stage Patricia and Richard had bankrupted themselves to build. But the room was not filled with the joyful clamor of a wedding reception. There was no clinking of champagne flutes, no string quartet playing softly in the background, no polite networking laughter. The silence was absolute, thick, and suffocating. 300 guests were frozen in their seats, staring straight ahead, as if paralyzed. Sitting at the front tables were the elite power players of Silicon Valley, local politicians, venture capitalists, and the entirety of my treacherous extended family. They had all come to witness a merger of wealth. Instead, they were witnessing an execution. Dion stood dead center on the elevated stage, right where he was supposed to be exchanging vows. He held a microphone in one hand, his posture relaxed but commanding. Without his tuxedo jacket, with his sleeves rolled up and his tie hanging loose, he looked less like a groom and more like a ruthless corporate raider delivering a hostile takeover. For over 2 decades, Dion's voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, chillingly calm and entirely devoid of emotion. Richard and Patricia have presented themselves as your peers. They have dined in your homes, invested in your funds, and positioned themselves as pillars of this community. They sold you an illusion of generational wealth and flawless business acumen. But money leaves a trail, and the trail I have uncovered over the past 72 hours reveals a truth far more sinister than simple financial mismanagement. Dion stepped to the edge of the stage, his dark eyes locking onto a specific table near the front. Uncle Arthur Dion said, his voice slicing through the heavy air. In 2018, Richard asked you for a short-term loan of $50,000 to bridge a gap in a commercial real estate venture. He promised you a 20% return. You never saw that return, did you? He told you the market turned. That was a lie. There was no real estate venture. Your $50,000 went directly to a sports bookie in Atlantic City to cover a massive illegal gambling debt. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I watched from the shadows as Uncle Arthur's face turned ashen, his wife clutching his arm in profound shock. Dion did not stop. He pivoted his gaze to another table. Aunt Caroline, 2 years ago, Patricia convinced you to invest $100,000 into a boutique interior design firm Madison was supposedly launching. She showed you glossy prospectuses and forged client lists. That firm never existed. Your investment was funneled through a Delaware shell company and used to make the minimum payments on predatory loans Richard had taken out from shadow syndicates to keep their house from falling into foreclosure. Leaning against the pillar, I felt a bitter, cynical smile touch my lips. My extended family had spent my entire life looking down on me. They had sneered at my thrift store clothes, mocked my decision to attend a state college, and constantly compared my perceived failures to Madison's shiny funded successes. They had bought into my parents' narrative that I was simply the ungrateful, lazy black sheep. Now, sitting in their expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, they were realizing that the very wealth they admired was stolen directly from their own pockets. The golden child was an active participant in corporate theft, and the elite parents were degenerate con artists. "They are not your peers," Dion declared, his voice rising in volume, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "They are predators. They built a facade of luxury by bleeding their own family dry and defrauding their closest friends. And their final desperate gambit was to use this wedding to marry into my family trust, intending to extort the Washington estate to pay off $1.2 million in illegal underground debt. The ballroom erupted into a low, dangerous rumble of furious whispers. 300 incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy people were simultaneously realizing they had been played for absolute fools. The outrage was palpable, a toxic cloud of betrayal and anger filling the cavernous space. Men in tailored suits were already pulling out their phones, likely contacting their personal lawyers and financial advisors. The polite veneer of high society had completely shattered, replaced by the ruthless instinct for self-preservation. "I am not asking you to simply take my word for it," Dayon said, his voice cutting through the rising chaos like a gunshot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. He turned toward the back of the stage and raised his hand. "As a forensic accountant, I believe that data is irrefutable," Dion stated, projecting his voice over the angry murmurs. "Numbers do not lie, and neither does the blockchain." Dion pressed a button on the remote, and the massive projector screen intended for a romantic wedding montage flashed to life with undeniable bank statements. The high-definition light of the massive projector screen washed over the darkened ballroom, casting a stark, clinical glow across the faces of 300 horrified guests. I leaned heavily against the cool marble pillar near the entrance, my head throbbing in a vicious rhythm with my heartbeat. The metallic taste of blood still lingered in my mouth, and the thick gauze wrapped around my temple felt tight and hot. Yet the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the pure, unadulterated adrenaline surging through my system. I watched the colossal screen above the stage, where the romantic wedding montage had been completely replaced by cold, hard financial ruin. Dion did not display complex financial jargon or convoluted tax returns. He displayed simple, irrefutable bank statements. Rows of dates, routing numbers, and withdrawal amounts were highlighted in aggressive neon yellow. The name of the originating account was printed in bold black letters at the very top of every single page. I watched the eyes of the guests darting across the screen reading the numbers. I watched the collective realization hit them like a physical shockwave. Gambling debts and fake interior design firms are crimes of financial desperation. Dion declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with forensic precision. But what you are looking at right now is a crime of pure, unadulterated malice. Richard and Patricia did not just defraud their friends and business partners, they systematically stole from the most vulnerable members of your own community. A suffocating silence gripped the room as the name on the account registered in the minds of the elite crowd. It was the St. Jude's Orphanage Fund. It was the primary charitable trust of the local parish. Half the people sitting in this very ballroom congregated at that church every single Sunday. They had attended the bake sales, hosted the silent auctions, and written massive tax-deductible checks to that specific fund. It was the absolute cornerstone of their community philanthropy. Over the past 4 years, Dion continued his tone absolutely ruthless. Richard used his position on the church finance committee to authorize 64 separate wire transfers. He funneled a total of $212,000 out of the orphanage fund and routed it directly into a Cayman Islands shell company. That shell company is registered exclusively to Patricia. The money you donated to provide housing, clothing, and medical care for children with nothing was used to pay for Patricia Country Club memberships, Madison designer handbags, and Richard luxury car leases. The silence shattered. It was not a murmur this time. It was an explosion. The outrage was instantaneous and deafening. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as people leaped to their feet. High society decorum vanished in a split second, entirely replaced by mob mentality. I watched Aunt Caroline, the woman who had spent my entire childhood criticizing my thrift store coats and mocking my state college education, turn a mottled shade of purple with rage. She marched toward the front row where venue security had just corralled Richard, Patricia, and Madison. The 3 of them had been marched out of the bridal suite by the guards to await the police, and now they were trapped in the epicenter of the ballroom, completely exposed to the wrath of their peers. "You stole from orphans!" Aunt Caroline shrieked, pointing a shaking jewel-encrusted finger directly at my mother. I wrote a $20,000 check to that fund last Christmas. You sat next to me in the pews and thanked me for my generosity. You absolute monster. Patricia cowered against the edge of the stage, attempting to shrink away from the verbal assault. The elegant, commanding matriarch who had dictated the rules of high society for decades was entirely gone. Her elaborate updo hung in greasy, ruined strands around her face. Her makeup was smeared with tears of sheer terror. She raised her hands as if to shield herself from the furious crowd closing in around her. I did not know, Patricia wailed, her voice cracking as she tried to back away into Richard, who stood frozen and catatonic. Richard handled the accounts. I thought the money was from his investments. I swear to you, Caroline, I had no idea. Do not lie to us, Uncle Arthur bellowed, slamming his fist onto a silk-draped table, knocking over a crystal centerpiece. We all saw the routing numbers on the screen. The shell company is in your name. You financed your entire fake life with stolen charity money. You are both going to federal prison. The social execution was flawless. It was brutal, swift, and absolute. Every single person in that room who had ever looked down on me, who had ever bought into my parents' narrative of the perfect wealthy family, was now tearing them apart. The elite investors looked disgusted. The local politicians were already texting their PR teams to distance themselves. My extended family, the people who had treated me like a disappointing outcast for my entire life, were shouting obscenities at the golden family they had worshipped. I stood in the shadows, my blood-soaked dress clinging to my skin, and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of vindication. For 25 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the punching bag they used to elevate themselves. They had convinced the world I was the problem. Now the world was seeing the truth in high definition. The empire was not just falling, it was burning to the ground, and there was nowhere for them to hide. Dion stood above the chaos, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. He did not need to say another word. The evidence had done the work for him. The police sirens outside were growing louder, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the high windows of the ballroom. Richard stood frozen, staring blankly at the floor. The fight had completely drained out of him. The violent feral predator who had struck me with a brass centerpiece was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken old man who knew his life was over. But Madison was not ready to surrender. The golden child had spent her entire existence manipulating her way out of trouble. She had never faced a single consequence in her life, and her narcissistic brain simply could not process the reality of her own downfall. She could not accept that her carefully laid extortion plot was dead, or that she was about to be arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud. She needed a scapegoat. She needed me. Madison's eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the furious faces of the guests, the flashing police lights outside, and Dion standing above her like an executioner. Her gaze snapped to the audio-visual technician table set up near the edge of the stage. Before the venue security guards could tighten their circle, Madison lunged. She scrambled over a fallen chair, her torn, heavily beaded wedding gown dragging behind her like a glittering anchor. She reached the technician table and snatched a backup wireless microphone from the soundboard. She flicked the switch, the feedback whining sharply through the ballroom speakers, instantly cutting through the shouting crowd. "Listen to me," Madison screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing with manic desperation. "You are all being lied to." The ballroom fell into a stunned, tense quiet. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the ruined bride. Madison stood panting, her chest heaving, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Dion, but her eyes were frantically searching the shadows of the room. She was looking for her favorite target. "I am a victim," Madison wailed, tears pouring down her face as she launched into the performance of a lifetime. "I didn't know about the church money. I didn't know about the offshore accounts. I am just as shocked as you are. Dion is lying about me because he is trying to cover up his own betrayal." Dion raised a single skeptical eyebrow. The sheer audacity of her pivot was almost impressive. "He is doing this to protect her!" Madison screamed, finally spotting me standing by the marble pillar at the back of the room. She thrust her finger toward me, the spotlight catching the blood soaking through my bandages. Riley seduced my fiancé. She made him make up these lies because she's obsessed with me. The entire ballroom pivoted as one massive collective entity. 300 pairs of widened, shocked eyes followed the trajectory of Madison's shaking finger and landed squarely on me. I stood against the cold marble pillar at the back of the room, still clutching my bleeding head, the crimson stains spreading across my ruined dress. I did not shrink back. I did not look away. I simply stared at my sister as she actively attempted to drag me down into the burning wreckage of her own making. For a fraction of a second, a dangerous murmur rippled through the crowd. High society thrived on scandalous love triangles, and Madison's desperate fabricated accusation was exactly the kind of salacious gossip that could muddy the waters. She was gambling everything on her ability to play the beautiful, betrayed victim. Dion did not yell. He did not lose his temper or raise his voice to counter her hysterical shrieks. He simply shook his head, looking down at the woman he had almost married with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. It was the look a person reserves for scraping something foul off the bottom of their shoe. He calmly walked over to the audio-visual technician table where Madison was currently having her meltdown. He bypassed her, completely ignoring her frantic, heaving breaths. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and picked up the auxiliary cord resting on the soundboard. "I didn't want to play this." "Madison," Dion said, his voice deadly quiet, but amplified perfectly through the ballroom speakers. "But you leave me no choice. You cannot claim victimhood when you are the architect of the crime." He plugged the cord directly into his phone. Madison froze, her hand still clutching the backup microphone, her eyes darting to the device in his hand. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and ghostly under the bright stage lights. The sudden realization that he had proof of her true nature hit her like a physical blow. "This audio was captured exactly 3 weeks ago," Dion announced to the silent room, his fingers navigating his phone screen. "It was recorded by the security system in the East Wing of the Washington family estate. Madison was hosting her bridesmaids for a weekend retreat. She thought they were in a private space. She thought the cameras were off. She was wrong." Dion pressed play. A sharp crackle of static hissed through the state-of-the-art sound system, followed immediately by the unmistakable shrill laughter of Madison and 2 of her closest friends. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried every syllable with terrifying clarity. There was no denying the voice. It was Madison, relaxed, arrogant, and completely unfiltered. "I cannot believe he is making me sign a prenup," Madison's recorded voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "It is so insulting. But whatever, his mother is an idiot and kept the loopholes wide open." I already had my lawyer look at it. A bridesmaid voice chimed in, asking a muffled question about the wedding budget and the Washington family wealth. Then came the killing blow. Madison's voice rang out crisp, clear, and dripping with absolute venom. "I just need to marry the black guy, secure the bag, drain his trust fund, and use his money to finally kick my loser sister out on the streets. Once the accounts are mingled, I can funnel enough out to cover my parents' debts and set myself up for life. He is so obsessed with me, he will never even notice the money missing until it is too late." The virulent racism and calculated gold-digging silenced the room completely. The words hit the crowd like a shockwave, instantly sucking the oxygen out of the massive space. It was one thing to hear allegations of financial fraud. It was an entirely different, uniquely horrifying thing to hear the raw, unfiltered bigotry and sociopathic greed of the bride broadcast to her own wedding guests. I watched Josephine Washington sitting in the front row. The matriarch of the family sat perfectly still, her spine rigid, her face an impenetrable mask of cold fury. The Washington family was one of the most prominent, respected black families in the state. They had built their empire on brilliance and perseverance. Hearing Madison reduce Dion to a racial slur and a walking bank account was the ultimate unforgivable violation. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total social annihilation. No one whispered, no one gasped. They simply stared at Madison in absolute horror. Madison stood frozen by the soundboard, the backup microphone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the floor. She could not spin this. She could not cry her way out of a high-definition audio recording. The mask had been ripped off, revealing the ugly, calculating predator underneath. Her bridesmaids sitting at a table near the stage were physically shrinking in their seats, desperately trying to hide their faces from the glaring eyes of the crowd. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sound from the floor near the stage, horrified not by the racism of her daughter, but by the undeniable reality that they were caught. Their entire lives built on the illusion of superiority and elite status were permanently destroyed. They were outcasts. They were criminals. They were finished. Dion stood tall on the stage, looking out over the silent, shocked crowd. He looked at his mother, who gave him a single definitive nod of approval. Then he looked at Madison, who was trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound. Dion unhooked his phone from the auxiliary cable. He picked up his primary microphone, holding it loosely in his hand. "The Washington family is officially done with you," Dion said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He dropped the mic. The heavy thud of the microphone hitting the wooden stage resonated through the silent room like a gavel slamming down on a judge desk. Dion stepped away from the podium and walked down the stage stairs, not looking back at the woman he had once planned to marry. As he reached the floor, the heavy soundproof double doors at the front of the venue burst open. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand ballroom, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers suddenly illuminated the hall. The harsh strobe effect cast long, chaotic shadows across the terrified faces of Richard, Patricia, and Madison. Uniformed officers and plainclothes financial fraud investigators began pouring into the lobby, their radios crackling sharply in the quiet night. The reckoning had finally arrived. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom did not just open, they were violently thrust apart. A swarm of uniformed police officers, flanked by plainclothes federal agents wearing tactical vests, flooded the grand entryway. Their heavy boots thudded against the imported marble flooring, a harsh militaristic rhythm that shattered the last remaining illusions of high society elegance. The lead detective, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a face carved from granite, stepped to the forefront. She held a stack of warrants in one hand and her badge in the other. The sea of wealthy guests parted instantly. Venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and local politicians shoved each other out of the way, desperate to avoid being caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. They pressed themselves against the silk-draped walls, holding their collective breath. Nobody wanted to be photographed standing next to the Sterlings. Richard Sterling, the lead detective, barked, her voice easily, cutting through the remaining murmurs of the crowd. Two heavily armed officers bypassed the frozen guests and marched directly onto the stage. Richard did not put up a fight. The towering, intimidating patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for decades simply crumpled. He looked small, hollow, and utterly pathetic as the officers grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom, a sound far more definitive than any wedding bell. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon," the detective stated, her eyes flicking briefly toward the bloody gauze on my temple before returning to Richard. "You are also being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." Richard did not say a word. He stared blankly at the floor, his face drained of all color, his arrogant posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of a broken con artist. The detective pivoted smoothly, pointing a commanding finger at my mother. "Patricia Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and acting as an accessory to embezzlement." "No," Patricia shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a wounded animal. Her carefully curated facade of aristocratic grace evaporated instantly. She slapped at the hands of the female officer trying to secure her wrists, thrashing wildly in her designer evening gown. "This is a misunderstanding. I am a victim. I did not know what he was doing." "Save it for the judge," the officer grunted swiftly, overpowering my mother and snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists. Madison was hyperventilating. The golden child stood entirely alone in the center of the devastated ballroom. She turned frantically toward the table where her bridesmaids were clustered. She reached out her hands, her face twisted in a mask of pure terror, expecting her loyal court to rally around her to shield her to validate her victimhood. Instead, the bridesmaids physically recoiled. The girls who had happily plotted to drain Dion Trust Fund just weeks prior were now grabbing their expensive clutches and backing away. One of them actually turned her back on Madison and fast walked toward the side exit. In the brutal economy of elite social circles, loyalty only lasted as long as the money did. Madison was a liability, radioactive, and bankrupt. She was left standing alone in the glaring lights, screaming at the police trapped inside a heavy beaded wedding gown that now resembled a glittering straitjacket. The officers began marching Richard and Patricia down the center aisle, leading them away from the wreckage of the altar and toward the flashing lights of the patrol cars waiting outside. As they passed the marble pillar where I was leaning, Patricia's frantic, tear-filled eyes locked onto me. She saw the dark spreading stain of blood soaking through the shoulder of my dress. She saw the heavy gauze wrapped tightly around my skull. She saw the absolute icy detachment in my eyes. In a final desperate act of manipulation, Patricia suddenly dropped her dead weight, forcing the officers to halt. She fell to her knees right there on the polished ballroom floor, the expensive fabric of her dress pooling around her in a chaotic mess. "Riley," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "Riley, please, you have to stop them. Tell them it was an accident. Tell them your father did not mean to hit you." I stared down at her, refusing to move a single inch. "We are blood! Riley!" Patricia screamed, weaponizing the very concept of family she had spent my entire life destroying. "We are your family. You cannot let them do this to us. You cannot send your own parents to prison. Please, I am begging you, remember who you are. We are blood." The absolute audacity of her plea settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. For 25 years, she had treated me like a parasite. She had mocked my clothes, belittled my career, and enabled a sister who treated me like garbage. She had stood by and watched her husband bash my head in with a solid brass centerpiece just hours ago. And now, kneeling in handcuffs, she dared to invoke the sacred bond of family. I pushed myself off the marble pillar. Every step I took sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through my skull, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I walked forward until I was standing just inches away from my kneeling mother. I looked down at her ruined makeup, her trembling shoulders, and the cold steel wrapped around her wrists. "Blood," I repeated, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the silent room. I gestured to the dark, sticky stain covering the side of my face and neck. "You mean this blood?" I asked, my tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "The blood your husband spilled, because I refused to let you steal from an innocent man. You bled your closest friends dry. You bled a charity fund meant for orphans. And today, you literally made me bleed to protect your pathetic fake empire." Patricia choked on a sob, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her final manipulation tactic was failing spectacularly. "Family protects each other," I continued, my voice growing colder with every word. "Family builds each other up. You have never protected anyone but yourselves. You only care about blood when you need a human shield. You spent my entire life making me feel like I was completely worthless, like I was the defective child ruining your perfect picture. But the truth is, I was the only real thing in this entire family." I crouched down slightly, bringing my face level with hers, ensuring she heard every single syllable of my final verdict. "You are not my mother," I stated, the absolute certainty of the words, severing the last invisible chain holding me to her. "You are just a degenerate criminal who finally got caught." I stood back up and looked at the police officer holding her arm. "Get her out of my sight," I commanded. The officer hauled Patricia to her feet. My mother let out a long, agonizing wail of pure defeat as she was dragged toward the double doors, her desperate cries completely ignored by the hundreds of guests watching her downfall. Through the glass walls, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the darkness as the police cruisers prepared to transport the architects of my lifelong misery. The reckoning was complete. As the officers hauled Patricia toward the sliding glass doors, she dug her heels into the imported marble flooring, desperately twisting her neck to look back at me. Her mascara-stained face was a mask of pure terror, completely stripped of the arrogant entitlement that had defined her entire existence. She opened her mouth, preparing to weaponize our bloodline one final pathetic time. I did not give her the chance. I stepped forward, closing the distance, and delivered the absolute, irrefutable truth. Family doesn't smash a brass centerpiece into their daughter's skull to pay off loan sharks, I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the lobby with icy precision. You aren't my family. You are criminals. I turned my back. I did not watch as the officers shoved my parents into the back of the waiting police cruisers, pressing their heads down to clear the door frames. I listened to the heavy doors slam shut, sealing their fates, and watched the reflection of the flashing lights pull away into the dark night. The Empire was gone. A sudden guttural scream shattered the remaining tension in the ballroom. You ruined everything! Madison shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a wounded animal. I pivoted just in time to see my sister charging at me. The heavy layers of her ruined, beaded wedding gown tore against the floorboards as she lunged. Her hands were curled into claws, her face contorted in absolute feral rage. She had lost her mark, lost her money, and lost her future, and she was aiming right for my injured head to exact her revenge. Before I could even raise my arms to defend myself, a wall materialized in front of me. Dayon stepped seamlessly into her path, his broad shoulders shielding me completely from her assault. But he was not alone. Josephine Washington, moving with a speed and ferocity that commanded immediate respect, flanked her son. The matriarch of the Washington Empire stood tall, her posture rigid, her eyes blazing with an uncompromising fire. Do not take another step toward her, Josephine commanded, her voice echoing with the authority of a judge handing down a life sentence. Madison skidded to a halt, her chest heaving, physically trapped by the impenetrable barrier of the family she had arrogantly tried to exploit. Venue security immediately converged on the scene. 2 large guards grabbed Madison by the arms, dragging her away from us. She thrashed and screamed, a pathetic, glittering mess of entitlement and fury, until she was finally pushed out the side doors into the waiting arms of local law enforcement. 6 months later, the justice system is often accused of moving slowly, but when an entire ballroom of Silicon Valley elite and prominent political figures are the victims of a fraudulent extortion scheme, the wheels of consequence spin with remarkable efficiency. Over the next 6 months, the Sterling family facade was systematically dismantled and sold off for scraps. Richard Sterling, entirely stripped of his expensive tailored suits and country club bravado, pleaded guilty to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and multiple counts of federal wire fraud. His high-priced defense attorneys could not save him from the irrefutable paper trail Dion had uncovered, nor could they argue against the damning security footage of my brutal assault. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, trading his corner office and imported cigars for a concrete cell and a standard-issue uniform. Patricia managed to avoid a prison sentence, pleading ignorance and striking a desperate deal to turn state's evidence against Richard's underground shadow syndicates. However, avoiding a jail cell did not save her from her own personal hell. Without Richard's income or their fraudulent investments to sustain her, she was left entirely destitute. The bank foreclosed on their sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate within weeks. The woman who had spent decades dictating the harsh rules of high society, sneering at anyone who wore last season's designer collections, was officially exiled. She was reduced to renting a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Her former friends completely blacklisted her. The socialites who used to drink her champagne now refused to answer her calls or even acknowledge her existence if they passed her on the street. She was a ghost in the very city she had once claimed to rule. But Madison's downfall was perhaps the most spectacular and publicly humiliating of them all. The audio recording of her racist gold-digging monologue had not just played over the ballroom speakers. It had been recorded by dozens of horrified guests on their smartphones. Within hours of the canceled wedding, the clip had gone viral. It trended across every major social media platform, forever cementing her face and voice as the ultimate symbol of toxic entitlement and blatant bigotry. The internet dubbed her the runaway racist bride, and her digital footprint was entirely obliterated by public outrage. The corporate world slammed its doors in her face permanently. Every public relations firm, marketing agency, and tech startup in the country placed her on a strict blacklist. Nobody would touch her. Faced with hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit card debt money she had aggressively spent maintaining the illusion of her lavish lifestyle, Madison was forced into the only job that would accept her application. The former golden child who had once scoffed at my state college education and mocked my thrift store coats was now working the grueling night shift as a cashier at a local 24-hour gas station. She spent her nights ringing up stale snacks and lottery tickets under harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, desperately trying to hide her face whenever a former high society peer walked through the doors to buy fuel. The new chapter. The scar on my temple had faded to a thin silver line. It was a permanent physical reminder of the night I stopped running, the night I stopped apologizing for surviving, and the night I finally claimed my own undeniable worth. I ran my fingers over the smooth skin, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of peace settle in my chest. I stood in the sleek, ultra-modern lobby of one of Silicon Valley's top venture capital firms. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, brilliant light across the polished concrete floors. The energy in the building was electric, thrumming with the promise of innovation and aggressive growth. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit that fit perfectly, carrying a heavy leather portfolio under my arm. Inside that portfolio was the complete business plan, financial projections, and proprietary algorithms for my own cybersecurity startup. While my family had spent years tearing me down, I had spent years building my skills quietly, efficiently, and entirely on my own terms. I had secured the patents. I had built the beta software. I was ready to launch. Ms. Sterling, the receptionist, called out, offering a polite, professional smile from behind her massive glass desk. "The partners are ready for you in the main boardroom." I took a slow, centering breath, adjusting the lapels of my blazer. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the disappointment. I was exactly where I belonged, armed with the brilliance they had tried so hard to bury. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom and stepped confidently into the room, ready to begin the rest of my life. The sheer audacity of her lie hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. Madison stood panting by the audiovisual table, her chest heaving against the ruined bodice of her designer gown, waiting for her desperate fabrication to take root. She expected murmurs. She expected the elite crowd to turn their collective suspicion toward the bleeding outcast leaning against the marble pillar. She was gambling everything on her lifelong ability to play the beautiful, victimized golden child. Dion did not yell. He did not lose his temper, nor did he raise his voice to counter her hysterical, grasping shrieks. He simply stood on the elevated stage and shook his head. The expression on his face was not anger. It was a profound, chilling disgust. It was the look of a man staring at a venomous snake that had finally been trapped in a glass box. He stepped down from the podium and walked with terrifying calm toward the technician table where Madison was currently staging her meltdown. He bypassed her, completely ignoring her frantic, hyperventilating breaths and her reaching, desperate hands. He pulled his smartphone from the pocket of his tailored trousers and picked up the auxiliary cord resting on the main soundboard. "I didn't want to play this." "Madison," Dion said, his voice deadly quiet but amplified perfectly through the ballroom speakers as he held the microphone in his left hand. "But you leave me no choice. You cannot claim victimhood when you are the architect of the crime." He plugged the cord directly into his phone. Madison froze. Her manic energy evaporated in a single terrifying instant. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and ghostly under the harsh stage lights. Her eyes darted to the device in his hand, the sudden horrifying realization hitting her like a physical blow. She did not know exactly what he had, but the absolute certainty radiating from him told her that her carefully constructed world was about to end. "This audio was captured exactly 3 weeks ago," Dion announced to the silent captive room, his long fingers navigating his phone screen. It was recorded by the security system in the East Wing of the Washington family estate. Madison was hosting her bridesmaids for a weekend retreat. She thought they were in a private space. She thought the cameras were off. She was wrong. Dion pressed play. A sharp crackle of static hissed through the state-of-the-art sound system, followed immediately by the unmistakable shrill laughter of Madison and two of her closest friends. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried every syllable with perfect forensic clarity. There was no denying the voice. It was Madison, relaxed, arrogant, and completely unfiltered. The sound of clinking champagne glasses echoed through the speakers, setting a scene of casual luxury that was about to turn incredibly ugly. "I cannot believe he is making me sign a prenuptial agreement," Madison recorded. Voice echoed off the cascading crystal chandeliers. "It is so insulting, but whatever, his mother is an idiot and kept the loopholes wide open. I already had my lawyer look at the draft." A bridesmaid voice chimed in, asking a muffled question about the wedding budget, the offshore accounts, and the immense Washington family wealth. Then came the killing blow. Madison's voice rang out crisp, clear, and dripping with absolute venom. "I just need to marry the black guy, secure the bag, drain his trust fund, and use his money to finally kick my loser sister out on the streets. Once the accounts are mingled, I can funnel enough out to cover my parents' debts and set myself up for life. He is so obsessed with me, he will never even notice the money missing until it is too late." The virulent racism and calculated gold digging silenced the room completely. The words hit the crowd like a shockwave, instantly sucking the oxygen out of the massive space. It was one thing to hear allegations of financial fraud. High society was accustomed to white-collar crimes, embezzlement, and tax evasion. It was an entirely different, uniquely horrifying thing to hear the raw, unfiltered bigotry and sociopathic greed of the bride broadcast to her own wedding guests. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, my hand pressing the blood-soaked gauze to my temple, and watched the destruction of the golden child. For my entire life, Madison had been untouchable. She was the pristine, flawless angel who could do no wrong, while I was the dark stain on the family portrait. My parents had enabled her cruelty, funded her vanity, and protected her lies. Now there was no protection left. The truth was echoing off the imported marble and silk drapery, and it was devastating. The elite crowd, usually so quick to cover up scandals with polite smiles and discreet whispers, was paralyzed. The affluent venture capitalists who had golfed with my father looked physically nauseated. The local politicians who had attended my mother charity galas were already mentally drafting statements to distance themselves from the sterling name. The social execution was no longer just about stolen money. It was about the utter moral bankruptcy of a family they had welcomed into their inner circles. I looked at Uncle Arthur and Aunt Caroline. The same relatives who had sneered at my thrift store clothes and whispered about my lack of ambition were now staring at Madison as if she were a monster. The illusion of the superior, untouchable sterling bloodline was dead-killed by the arrogance of its favorite daughter. I watched Josephine Washington sitting in the front row. The matriarch of the family sat perfectly still, her spine rigid, her face an impenetrable mask of cold fury. The Washington family was one of the most prominent, respected black families in the state. They had built their empire on brilliance, perseverance, and flawless integrity. Hearing Madison reduce Dion to a racial slur and a walking bank account was the ultimate unforgivable violation. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total social annihilation. No one whispered. No one gasped. They simply stared at Madison in absolute horror. The elite investors, the politicians, the extended family members who had worshipped at the altar of the Sterling family perfection all recoiled simultaneously. Madison stood frozen by the soundboard. The backup microphone slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She could not spin this. She could not cry her way out of a high-definition audio recording. The mask had been violently ripped off, revealing the ugly, calculating predator underneath. Her bridesmaids, sitting at a table near the stage, were physically shrinking in their seats, desperately trying to hide their faces behind their hands to escape the glaring, furious eyes of the crowd. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sound from the floor near the stage, horrified not by the racism of her daughter, but by the undeniable reality that they were caught. Their entire lives built on the illusion of superiority and elite status were permanently destroyed. They were outcasts. They were criminals. They were finished. Dion stood tall near the soundboard, looking out over the silent, shocked crowd. He looked at his mother, who gave him a single definitive nod of approval. Then he looked at Madison, who was trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. "The Washington family is officially done with you," Dion said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He unhooked his phone from the auxiliary cable and looked down at the microphone in his hand. He did not offer another explanation. He did not hurl insults or demand an apology. Dion simply dropped the mic. The heavy thud of the microphone hitting the wooden floor resonated through the silent room like a gavel slamming down on a judge desk. Dion turned his back on the ruined bride and began walking toward his mother. As he moved, a new sound began to filter through the heavy, soundproof double doors at the front of the venue. It started as a distant wail, quickly growing into a piercing, unavoidable chorus of sirens. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the grand ballroom, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers suddenly illuminated the hall.